was essentially me making those decisions, telling my mom, you know, I need to take the car keys away, but I've hired someone to drive you on errands. Mom, I think it's good to have someone come and be with you a few hours every day. Mom, I think it's time to sell your home and it would be a good idea for you to move in with me. And then eventually, Mom, I think you're going to be better off with round the clock care. It's going to be safer for you. It's going to be better for you. All of those decisions I made. And, like I said, I discussed them with my mom, but she was not in a position to fully rationally, participate in those conversations. It was me telling her what to do at the end of the day. And I hated that. It was an awful feeling.
Welcome to Spark Me, a podcast for women who know life is just getting interesting.
Each week, we spark great conversations, share lived experiences, real resources, and tap into the collective wisdom that comes from learning together.
If you're looking for connection, not perfection, fresh ideas, and a community where you truly belong,
then pull up a chair. You're in the right place. Welcome to Spark Me.
Well, hey there, Michelle. It's so great to see you.
Hey, Liz. Awesome to see you again, as always.
I am so excited about the guest that we have today. This is probably one of the most important topics that families could talk about. And unfortunately, we rarely do. So I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce this great guest, and then we'll get going.
Sounds fantastic. So our guest today is Cameron Huddleston, and I am going to read a little intro about her because, like we just said, this is going to be wonderful. I can't wait to get to this topic because most of us have a version of this moment. You're home for the holidays, you notice your dad maybe has lost a lot of weight, or your mom tells the same story 3 times at dinner and laughs it off. Or you go to help someone with something small, a bill, a form, and you realize you have no idea where anything is. No will, no account numbers, no idea who their doctor is or what they actually want if things go sideways. And the conversation you've been meaning to have still hasn't happened because there's never a good time, because they'll get offended, because honestly, it scares you too. Our guest today knows that moment better than most anyone. Cameron is an award-winning personal finance journalist with 20 years of experience, but the book she wrote didn't come from a newsroom. It came from being 35 years old, raising 3 kids, and watching her mother receive an Alzheimer's diagnosis with no financial plan in place. She had to figure it all out alone in real time while her life was already full. That experience became Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk, a book the Washington Post called an excellent step-by-step guide to one of the hardest conversations families face. So Cameron, welcome to Spark Me.
So thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh my gosh, we're so excited to have you. Again, what a relevant topic. So I just want to start with you're 35, your kids are little, your mother was just diagnosed with Alzheimer's. What was the first moment you realized you were completely unprepared, not emotionally, but practically?
It wasn't all of a sudden because I could see that she was having problems before the diagnosis. Um, Actually, she had gone to see one neurologist who did not diagnose her with Alzheimer's. And then it was several months later when a friend of hers talked her into going to see another neurologist. And when she got the results from that test, I went with her to that appointment. And that's when we were told that she had Alzheimer's, but I already knew. I mean, the writing was on the wall, so to speak. It was very obvious that she had been forgetting things. But I used that moment to start putting a plan into action because we had not had any detailed conversations about her finances. Actually, several years before her diagnosis, I had had a conversation with her about looking into long-term care insurance because she was divorced, she was living on her own, and I said to her, "Mom, you should look into getting some insurance to pay for long-term care if you ever need it." And I'm lucky because she took my advice, but unfortunately, she could not get coverage because she had another pre-existing health condition that made her too high risk. And of course, in retrospect, I should have used that as an opportunity to have those conversations, which I didn't have until she was diagnosed. And, I learned that that's not when you should be having those conversations because that's when emotions are running high. When you have those conversations beforehand, you're talking in hypothetical terms. If this happens, what should we do? How much support would you need from me? What sort of care would you want? What sort of plans do you have to pay for care? When you're in the heat of the moment, suddenly it's like, okay, mom, we need to go to an estate planning attorney right away and get all your estate planning documents updated. And luckily, she was still mentally competent enough to sign those documents, but I knew that I was going to be that I needed to be named her power of attorney so I could make financial decisions for her. I needed to be her healthcare surrogate so I could make medical decisions for her. I wanted to make sure her will was updated. We got that done. And then the estate planning attorney suggested that we go to the bank together to let the bank know that I had been named my mom's power of attorney, and so that was helpful getting that third party to say, "This is the next step that you should take." My mom listened to her, we went together, didn't have any issues. I know a lot of people do have that issue when they go to the bank and they say, "Mom has dementia, I'm her power of attorney, here's the document," and the bank says, "Well, you need to sign our documents, and it's your mom who needs to sign the documents." And people, run into all sorts of hurdles when they need to start actually stepping into that role of financial caregiver or, the healthcare decision maker. But, it was still a shock. It was still a lot to digest. But I'm fortunate because I've been a personal finance journalist for a long time. So I had a lot more knowledge about what steps needed to be taken. If I didn't know that, then I wouldn't have known to go to a estate planning attorney to make sure that I had the legal right to make financial decisions for her. All of those things would have been, I would have missed them. And then I would have found myself in a really difficult position down the road when she was no longer able to make any decisions on her own.
You're very lucky that she was still in a good mental state when all that happened, um, and that you had a little bit of prior knowledge to this. But again, you're at the time with that prior knowledge, this is happening. You have a very full life when it's happening. What is one thing looking at that time that you wish, you had known ahead of time that would have been so useful before and then after she started kind of deteriorating, was there anything else that was missing?
I do wish we had had conversations about what sort of care she would want if she ever needed long-term care because I had to make those decisions for her. And that's such a rotten position to be in, to make those sort of decisions for your parent where you're having to almost be the parent. And we had conversations, but she would forget that we had them the next day, the next few hours. And so it was essentially me making those decisions, telling my mom, Mom, you know, I need to take the car keys away, but I've hired someone to drive you on errands. Mom, I think it's good to have someone come and be with you a few hours every day. Mom, I think it's time to sell your home and it would be a good idea for you to move in with me. And then eventually, Mom, I think you're going to be better off with round the clock care. It's going to be safer for you. It's going to be better for you. All of those decisions I made. And, like I said, I discussed them with my mom, but she was not in a position to fully rationally, participate in those
Mhm.
conversations. It was me telling her what to do at the end of the day. And I hated that. It was an awful feeling.
Cameron, I think that those conversations are critical, but boy, they're so hard to have with our parents because it like flies into the face of their independence, right? Like suddenly if you bring it up, they're thinking, well, no, I'm handling everything. I'm good. I'm not old. I'm not all of those things, right? So, so how do you broach the subject without getting them, to be defensive or protective of their independence?
That's a good question. And I found that there are a couple of different ways. Actually, there's several different ways that you can go about these conversations. One thing you can do is get that independent third party involved. As I said, when we met with the estate planning attorney and she suggested that we go to the bank, there was that unbiased person, this professional telling my mom, this is what you and your daughter need to do next. So that's not me saying, hey, mom, we need to go take this document that essentially appoints me to make decisions for you. It's the attorney telling us that we need to take that step. So that's one thing that you can do. And maybe it's the family doctor, calling the doctor and saying, and which is something I actually did when she was showing signs of memory loss. I called her doctor because I felt very nervous about telling her that I was noticing that she was forgetting things. So I called him and said, hey, the next time my mom's in there, could you suggest that she meet with a neurologist just to check things out? And he did that. And he was wonderful. You can use stories. And so when my mother needed to stop driving because her friends were calling me and telling me that she was getting confused driving at night, driving to and from her book club meetings at night. And I had to tell her that it's not safe for her to drive. I used a story about her own father. Her father in his 80s started having some memory loss issues. And we were, my mom's parents lived in another city. We were there visiting because my mom's mother had had a heart attack. My mother left my sister and me with our grandfather, and she warned us, don't get in the car with him. If he wants to go for a drive, don't get in the car. And of course, what happens? He's like, come on, kids, let's go for a drive. And the whole time we're terrified, Granddaddy, do you know where you are? And so I use that story with my mom. Mom, do you remember when this happened? I don't want you to be in the same situation like your father was, continuing to drive, and it was dangerous. And so she gave me the keys to her car you know, without a lot of pushback. I was lucky. When I suggested that she move into the house with me, I focused on the positives, telling her, Mom, this is, you'll get to see your grandkids more. You can help me work in the garden, work in the yard because that's something she liked to do. You can have dinners with us. It'll be nice. We'll be together. I didn't say, Mom, it's time to move because you're not safe alone. I tried to focus on the positives and spin it that way so that it didn't feel like I was trying to take away her independence. I was trying to give her an opportunity to spend more time with us, the grandkids. I mean, I'm sure she she knew the real reason, but I was trying to couch it in positive terms. Getting someone else involved, as I mentioned, one of her friends encouraged her to go to that second neurologist. And so there are a variety of ways that you can have these conversations. Sometimes it takes trying a lot of different approaches. Sometimes it's going to take a while to get through to your parents. I have a friend of mine who's actually a financial advisor, and it took her years to get her mother to finally admit that she even had estate planning documents and where they were, but she didn't give up. And so, again, this is why I really encourage people to have these conversations before those emergencies happen so that, at least you've laid the groundwork. At least you started talking about things and maybe you don't have all the information, but you have some.
I love everything you're saying here because it's just because I know our listeners right now, people who are out there are relating to this so hard, right? Like they've had a parent who they see the memory going, or they can't. Their parents get very ornery, and I'm sort of seeing this interesting two ends of life, right? When our kids are young and trying to gain independence, they don't want to listen to us, and so you often need that third party to say something that you've told them 10 times, but now they're going to listen because it came from a teacher or a coach or somebody else, a friend. And that now we're on the opposite end of the spectrum where they don't want to lose the independence. And so they're fighting against that, right? And you have these two things probably happening at the same time. And so I love that you framed it with your mom as, using third parties who are unbiased, who can give sort of a matter of fact opinion, um, and telling them stories that they would relate to because they went through that at one point themselves. Um, Spinning it as something positive, right? Here's like, let's not look at the negative side. Not taking you away. I'm giving you an opportunity to hang out with your grandkids, and then using friends as that trusted person, to sort of back what you're saying too. That's all gold, Cameron. That's such like amazing stuff. Um, what was something you felt like, was there something you found out you shouldn't say?
Well, I'm sure I said a lot of things wrong. I know I did, and I wasn't always patient enough with my mom. So, of course, if I could go back and do things over again, I would be more sensitive. I would be more patient. Of course, telling parents you can't do something, that's going
Mhm.
to put them on the defensive right away. Just like if you tell your kids you can't do it, you have to use a different approach. And so, I mean, there are so many things I would do differently, but I mean, it's a learning experience. I mean, none of us ever expects that we're going to have to step into the role of essentially being a parent to a parent. It's so much more difficult than being a parent to a child because your kids are younger than you. They're looking up to you. You are the authority. Of course, they don't always listen to you, but when you're the child telling a parent what to do, it's just that role reversal is so difficult. And yes, parents, they can be ornery, like you said. They don't want to do it. And so you've got to be careful and you've got to put yourself in their shoes. And it's not always easy when they're frustrating you and you can see the writing on the wall and they can't. Um, but it's just, I mean, it's taking a step back. It's even getting help. There are people out there who can help families in these situations. There are aging life care professionals. They were formerly called geriatric care managers. There's an aging life care association. You can reach out to them and find someone in your area who can help you navigate these conversations, who can be that third party, who can be there to essentially hold your hand through all of this. If you're working with a financial advisor, the financial advisor might be able to invite the parents in and, mom and dad, let's go meet with my advisor. They've really helped me with a lot of things. So might be a good idea just to talk to them. Don't worry about it. I'll pay for it, or getting them to meet with that estate planning attorney or elder law attorney. There are a lot of people out there who can help with these things. And that's something that I was not so good about, is not reaching out for enough help. I mentioned that I worked with the estate planning attorney, but I was very reluctant to ask for help. I kept thinking, I've got this, I can do this. Sometimes I didn't know who to turn to for help. I didn't have anyone my age who was in this situation because I was relatively young when it happened. My friends now are all reaching out to me because they're at the point when their parents are experiencing this and they're asking me what to do. But I had no one to ask about this. And so, you know, looking for support groups. Don't be afraid to ask your friends if they're going through this because, as women, we want to be, we want to, I don't want to say we want to be the heroes, but I think we feel like it. Like we can't show any weakness. We had to let people think that we got it under control. And when you do that, it makes it harder for yourself. And I learned that the hard way.
Cameron, it's interesting because I think that having gone through some of this stuff personally, one of the things that I find interesting is that when you're the only person making the decision, there's so much pressure, right? I mean, it's all on you. And then when you have siblings, that alleviates that pressure, but that can also create some other dynamics. Can you talk about navigating these conversations when there's multiple siblings in a family and maybe not everybody is always on the same page at the same time?
Sure. I mean, let's be honest. Sometimes the sibling dynamics are more complicated than having those conversations with your parents or having to step into that caregiving role for a parent. And all those things from childhood can surface in these moments of emergency. And so I do think it's really important, again, if you can have conversations with your siblings before emergencies happen. Sit down with your siblings before you talk to mom and dad. Before you try to have those conversations with mom and dad and say, let's talk about the fact that we need to talk to mom and dad about their finances. Let's decide when we should do it and how we're going to do it and who is going to do it. Will it be all of us or just one of us? And if you've got a sibling who doesn't want to participate, you don't need to force it. It's a good idea, though, to just let them know, look, I understand if you don't want to be involved in this, that's okay. I'm going to keep you updated on what's happening because you never know when they're going to want to maybe get involved in the future. And so have that conversation with your siblings, letting them know we're here to talk about mom and dad and what's best for them. So we need to keep the focus on that. Let's have a plan. Of course, at the end of the day, it's mom and dad's decision who's going to be the power of attorney, the healthcare surrogate. But of course, you and your siblings can discuss it. You can have that conversation, whether one of you feels like you're more capable of handling financial matters, whether one of you feels more capable of providing hands on care, and how all of you will support each other. Because, you know, as we know, I mean, if there's a daughter and then there's sons, it's usually going to fall, on the daughter to become that primary caregiver. I have a sister, but she lives several states away. So I had to be the one in charge of everything just because of proximity. And so, talking to your siblings, I think too, if you are the one who's a caregiver, again, keeping those lines of communication open with your siblings and letting them know when you need help and what sort of help you need. Because if it appears to them that you got it under control, they might not raise their hand and say, hey, what can I do to help? You need to be very clear with your siblings what sort of support you need and not just, hey, do you think you can help out? But hey, I need to start researching assisted living facilities for dad. Can you help with that? Can you do that research? Because I've got to get dad to a doctor's appointment this week and I'm busy with work. Can you do this for me? Or maybe if you're the one who is providing that care, asking your siblings to chip in financially, but be specific about what sort of support you need. And if they're not willing to provide support, but they're willing to share a lot of criticism with you about how you're managing things. And I've talked to lots of social workers about this. It is okay to let your siblings know, to let them know, you know, I've asked you for support. You haven't been willing to provide support. I'm doing the best I can. I would appreciate if you don't criticize what I'm doing here. I mean, it's okay to create some boundaries and let your siblings know if they're not willing to help, but they want to criticize you, it's okay to let them know that you're not okay with that.
I love that idea of boundaries. That's so smart. And it does seem like you're bringing up some terms that are come up very often when we're planning these things. Power of attorney, healthcare advocate. You know, what are the main roles that either one person takes on or that different siblings can take on that they should start talking about as early as possible? Because and then there's things like that come into it, like insurance, that are scary, but what are those roles and what do they mean, Cameron?
Sure. So if you are in the fortunate position of being able to have conversations with your parents while they are still healthy, what you want to make sure is whether they have estate planning documents. And I know when you hear that term, estate planning documents, that sounds like something that only wealthy people do. Everyone needs these documents. You need what is called a power of attorney document. that, and your parents need this, you need it, parents need it. It lets you name someone or more than one person to make financial decisions for you if you are unable to yourself. Ideally, you want your parents to have a general durable power of attorney. General meaning that it's going to give you or a sibling or someone else broad powers to make decisions for them. Durable means it is essentially goes into effect right away, remains in effect if they become mentally incapacitated. And your parents might say, well, hold on a second. I'm fine right now. Why do I want to give you this much power? And say to your parents is, look, this has to be in place now. The document has to be drafted and signed while you're still mentally competent. If you are no longer competent to sign this document, then what's going to happen is that I'm going to have to go to court and petition to become your conservator. I'm essentially putting you on trial. A doctor's going to have to come in and testify that you are no longer mentally capable of managing your own finances. So it's important for your parents to have this power of attorney document in place, have it drafted and signed while they're still mentally competent. If they're not comfortable, though, giving you that much power at this point in their lives, then what you can tell them is simply hang on to the document, put it someplace safe, and let me know when and how I can access it. I need the actual document when I go to the bank or when I contact your financial institutions. They're going to need to see it as proof that I am your power of attorney. I can't simply call up the bank and say, Mom is naming her power of attorney. They're not going to trust me on that. They've got to see the document. And so if it makes you feel better, again, put that document someplace safe and tell me when and how I can access it. Same goes for a healthcare power of attorney. It's also called a healthcare surrogate or a healthcare proxy. It allows you to name someone to make medical decisions for you if you can't. This document, again, must be drafted and signed while your parents are mentally competent. Your parents will also need what's called an advance directive or living will that spells out what sort of end of life medical care they do or do not want. Now, they might think, well, if I've named you my healthcare power of attorney, why do I need this? Well, that lets them spell out whether they actually want to be on life support, whether they want any sort of, pain relief, if they are at the end stage of life. As their healthcare power of attorney, if there are any gray areas, then you can step in and make some decisions. But they need to let you know as their child what their wishes are so that you don't have to make those decisions for them. And then, of course, finally, they need a will or a trust that spells out who gets what when they die. You know, depending on where you live, all of these documents could cost a couple $1,000s. If you get a trust, it's going to cost more. If your parents have limited resources, you might offer to give this to them as a gift. Happy Mother's Day. I made an appointment with an estate planning attorney to have all these documents for you because I want to know what your wishes are. It's very important and they need to be in writing. It's okay if they cannot afford to get a will. There are some good DIY products that are available online. If they can only afford to pay for one document, I would encourage them to pay for that power of attorney document. It's complicated. There are several different versions. It's really good to meet with an attorney so they can discuss what their wishes are. And then again, if down the road you do or your siblings have to step in as that agent under power of attorney, to have something that's drafted by an attorney specific to their state's laws increases the chances that the bank, that the financial institution is going to accept it. If you get pushback, then you can always get that attorney who drafted the document on the phone.
Cameron, didn't you? I feel like in your book, you told a story which really sort of connected for me on how important this is. And I believe it was a gentleman named John who didn't have this document in place and had to go to the court system.
It
Could you?
was Doug. It
Oh,
was actually
Doug.
it was
Sorry.
Doug. Yes, yes. It was Doug Nordman. His father had Alzheimer's disease, and he did not have any of these estate planning documents. And he ended up in the emergency room with emergency surgery and then was moved into a nursing care facility. And Doug could not access his father's bank account and pay any of these bills that were piling up because he had not been named his father's power of attorney. He called the bank, and the bank said, "Well, sorry, we can't do anything for you." He did have to go to court. It took 9 months and $10,000 to go through the process of being named his dad's conservator. And then every year after that, he had to file a report with the court detailing how he was managing his dad's finances. I mean, you don't have to do that if you're power of attorney. You don't have to report to any sort of court, any sort of judge. But if you are named conservator, then you have these filing requirements. Um, Very expensive, very time consuming, very difficult.
What a cautionary tale, right? If you could have that open dialogue with your parents and do some simple paperwork in advance, you can avoid all of that 10,000, $10,000 in legal fees and all of the administrative nightmare of having to, go to the courts every year.
Certainly.
Well,
Absolutely.
the other thing that having these conversations early, having seen two parents go through like that end of life and all the healthcare and insurance and everything you need at that time, but also if you the earlier you start to handle this, the more you have say over what you want to happen when those difficult decision points come about, do we continue this kind of care? Do we move into hospice? Do we stop? Like what happens? Do we resuscitate? You can kind of have those conversations earlier and have control over your end of life. Is that something that you've seen, Cameron?
Certainly, certainly. And I think that's a good point to make to parents because these conversations to them can feel like they are giving up control. And so when you're trying to start them or as you're having them, focus on that. Focus on how this gives them control. Mom and dad, I want to know your wishes because I want to be able to follow those wishes. They need to be in writing. And by doing this, you get a say in what happens. You get a say in who makes a decision about your finances if something happens to you. You get a say in who makes decisions about your health care. You get a say in what sort of medical care you're getting if something happens to you, like a coma, and you're not capable of making those decisions. You get a say in who gets what when you die. It's your wishes are important to me, and so you need to put them in writing so that we can follow them.
I feel like a lot of families wait for the shoe to drop in order to react to these things. So if a parent doesn't want to leave a house, even though they're starting to struggle physically, or as you went through, perhaps are having memory issues, or they don't want to give up the keys to their car or the control of their money, they wait until it's often like, well, an accident has to happen, something terrible almost has to happen before the parent is willing to do that. And I think what you're saying is the earlier you start these conversations, the less you might come up against those kind of circumstances.
Certainly, and you can discuss those circumstances in advance. So your parents might say, "Well, I'm doing fine. We don't need to have this conversation right now." And you can say, "Well, sure, I understand that. So let's talk about maybe at what point you think or under what situation you think I might need to get involved. Like, what would have to happen, mom and dad, for you to start sharing some information? Or what would have to happen for me that you would require help from me?" Getting them to think about, well, if I got diagnosed with Alzheimer's, then yes, maybe at that point I would be willing to start doing some things. We don't want to think about those things because they're horrible. Who wants to think about the possibility of ending up with dementia? Who wants to think about the possibility of having to be in a nursing home? No one wants to have to think about it. And so introducing these ideas, introducing these concepts, although they're difficult, it hopefully will get those wheels turning inside your parents' heads and getting them, and they might initially say, no, 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 I don't want to talk about this, but then they might start thinking about it. A mom might say to dad, you know, uh, you know, Cameron was making a good point. What would happen if something happens to you and I'm 85 years old and I can't take care of you because I can't get you up and down the stairs? What would we do? Would we call the kids to help? Would we think about maybe moving into a assisted living facility? Maybe both parents aren't gonna get really excited thinking about this, but maybe one of them, at least if you can get through to one of them, if both parents are still living, one might start saying something to the other, and again, it might take some time. Um, because it is. I mean, it's really difficult, and again, it kind of goes back to telling your parents, I don't want to make these decisions for you. And let's be honest, mom and dad, I might make a decision that's convenient for me. It might not be what you want. So if you want to have a say, let's talk about this. Tell
Yeah.
me what you want because I'm going to make those decisions for you and you might not be happy with them.
I think that you did a great job too and I thought this was sort of like a nice way to approach it. Like sometimes it's hard to have these like head on conversations, right? Like, and so I thought one of your tools was start sharing stories of other, friends or, situations that you've heard about with your parents, and so that they can start to have that in the back of their mind like, well, gosh, we don't want that to happen to us, and and really sort of feed them into, okay, let's have this conversation.
Sure. Telling stories is a great way to start these conversations. I'm glad you brought up that story in my book about Doug Nordman because a friend of mine actually, when she read my book, she went to her parents and she's like, Chapter 4, read this. Read this and let's have a conversation. Um, you know, if you are of a certain age, you likely know someone, a friend, a work colleague had who is involved with their parents' lives, whether it's their finances, whether it's their care. And so going to mom and dad and saying, you know, my friend Sally at work, it's been really hard for her lately because her father passed away recently. Her mom's alone now and she's starting to forget things. And, Sally's just having a really hard time figuring out what to do. I don't want us to end up in a situation like that. I think it would be good if we could talk now while you're still doing really well, mom, about what would we do if a situation like that occurred. And so stories are a really natural way. I think one thing that people can use with their parents if they're having a really hard time getting through to them is to talk about scams because we are all targeted by scammers. They reach out to you regardless of your age. And so you can let your parents know if you got one of those calls telling you that the IRS is going to audit you and that you need to go to a cryptocurrency machine and hand over $10,000. Okay, mom and dad, I just got this call. I want you to be aware about it, or sending them articles that you've read about scams. Read about this, thought you might be interested. So this kind of opens the door to those financial conversations in a way that can be less threatening. Hey, heard about this, want to protect you. I've been reading about how to protect yourself from scams. Would you like me to help you set up a security freeze on your credit reports? Let me help you do that. Oh, look, I found this list of scam red flags on this website, which I actually have on my website at KarenHuddleston.com. It's free. Hey, I found this list of scam red flags. Why don't you hang it up on the refrigerator or by the phone so that if you get a call, you can look and be like, oh, hey, this is a red flag. Better hang up on this call right now. I think talking about scams is a really easy way to kind of open the door to more financial conversations with your parents.
That actually I'm sorry. So right on the scams because our uncle, we had an uncle who, he wasn't married and didn't have any kids, so he lived alone. And it was actually a well-trained teller at a local community bank, Fidelity Bank, who he came to get out money. Something didn't seem right in the request he was making to this teller, and they were trained to sort of listen for and identify, if somebody's being scammed. And it turns out it was a very complex scam that he was being told, you can't say anything to anybody, and if you do this, then it's going to kick something off that's going to affect a loved one. It was very high level scam, and he was very embarrassed that he fell for it. But that also, it not only brings up scams, but then, in a lot of families, it's not just parents. There are uncles and aunts and loved ones who are going through the same thing, and it's not always a very direct line of power of attorney. And so these same conversations kind of go for them, Cameron. And do you have a lot of people who deal with not just parents, but they're also dealing with other family members?
Sure, grandparents, an aunt, an uncle, siblings, family friends. There are plenty of people out there who do not have a spouse or children of their own. And that's why it's especially important for people who are solo agers and people who are living alone as they get older to have these documents in place, to have someone who can help out if something happens to them. If they have someone they trust they can go to and they can say, I just got this really strange call. What do you think? What should I do? And so, of course, I would encourage people too, if you've got the aunt or the uncle or the cousin or another family member who is living alone, to reach out and check in on them, connect with them so that maybe you can be their person that they can reach out to when they get that strange email or the call or if they need a little help, as they get older.
So, Cameron, in your book, in chapter 9, you lay out essential like documents, account numbers, information essentially that you need, whether it's for your parents, your uncle, your aunts, grandparents. First of all, it was an incredibly comprehensive list. So well done. I would highly recommend that list to everybody. Um, Once people fill out once they get their estate planning documents together and their powers of attorney, how frequently should they go back and relook at things and update things? Because, if you sign an advance directive 20 years ago, a lot may have changed, both legally and personally in your life. And that advance directive may not be as effective as you had hoped it would be.
Sure. So, of course, if there's any major life event, so if there's a divorce, if a spouse dies, if you're younger and you add another child to your family, those are always good times to look at those documents and see what needs to be updated. My husband and I have actually gone through the process of updating our estate planning documents 3 times. 3 times. I am 53 and we have done that process 3 times already. We will probably do it again. Um, and so, of course, yes, when there's a big life event, review it and encouraging your parents, if dad passes away, it's a great time to have a conversation with mom to say, hey, mom, let's make sure we update those documents because dad was probably your guy for everything. And so now we need to make sure that maybe you've named one of us as your financial decision maker, your medical decision maker, updating your will. All these things need to happen. Um, Sometimes you will hear the term used to describe a power of attorney as stale because it was drafted, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. These things don't expire. And so, if you've got the mother who's named you as agent on your power of attorney, and the bank says, well, this was drafted 20 years ago. How do I know that this is still accurate? She still wants you to be power of attorney. Well, I mean, it's a legal document. You have to honor it. They might, like I said, throw out the word stale. But, again, it doesn't hurt to go and review those every 10 years or so, even if there aren't any changes in your life. Make sure it's still the way you remember it. And maybe you've changed your mind. Maybe you had that living will drafted when you were in your 40s and you had kids and you wanted every sort of life sustaining measure because you you have kids who were counting on you, and now you're like, no, it's okay. Like, please don't keep me in a coma in a vegetative state for months on end. That's too expensive. Let's update this, and let's I've changed my mind about these things now. And so it is a good idea, every 10 years or so to review those if there hasn't been a major life event that would force you to make changes sooner. As far as, keeping a list of your financial accounts and that sort of thing, I think it's always good to have that sort of list. Your spouse, if you're married, your spouse needs to know what sort of accounts you have, how to access accounts. If something happens to you, you need that have that information so that the people you've named as your financial power of attorney and medical power of attorney can get access to your accounts if something happens to you. My husband and I have that list. We've had the conversation with our two adult daughters who are 19 and 21. They know everything. They know where everything is because we've named them as our alternate powers of attorney, our alternate healthcare power of attorney. So if something happens to my husband and he's not around to make decisions for me, they're going to have to step up. And we wanted them to have that information and know what our wishes were. We don't want to give them you know, give them this responsibility without telling them the information they need to have in order to step into these roles.
And and just to follow up on that, like on your list, obviously I think everybody expects, okay, estate planning documents, financial information, but on your list also included things like a list of all your medications for your parents, a list of their medical history, because if you end up at a hospital, that's the first thing that they're going to ask for at intake is what medications are your parents on, right? And
Yes.
then and the other thing is, and I thought this was really bright, really smart, their social media account and passwords. Because if something happens to your parent, you know, closing down their social media accounts is really important. And it's frankly not top of mind. And otherwise they're going to be out there forever, right?
Right. And it's also a good way, if you know how to access those accounts, to let their friends know that something has happened to them. If a friend has passed away, then you can use that social media account to post details about their funeral service because you might not know who all of their friends are, and you don't want them to not be able to pay their final regards to your parent when they pass away. And so, yes, having you need all the information. You need all of the information because if you have to be a caregiver like I was for my mom and manage all of her finances, you need to know every account that exists. You need to know how to access that account. I mean, I had to play detective and go through my mom's tax returns, go through her mail to figure out what sort of accounts she had. She had one account, and I wrote about this in the book. She had one account that I didn't know existed until we started getting letters that this account was going to be turned over to the state as an unclaimed asset for inactivity. And I was like, "What? What is this?" It was a brokerage account and it had about $50,000 in it. Um, and so luckily, yeah, I found out about it before it was turned over to the state, was able to get access to the account. I mean, $50,000, that covered close to a year's worth of payments for her memory care facility. And so, but I almost lost it. I almost lost $50,000 of my mom's money because I didn't know the account existed. And so, you know, making that list or asking your parents to make that list of everything they can think of is so important. And this is actually one way that you can have the conversation. If they don't want to tell you information about your finances, ask them to put it in writing, put it someplace safe with those estate planning documents, and tell you when and how you can access it. And that lets them maintain control over that information until the point when you actually need it.
Cameron, that just brought back for me that you said you've been talking to your daughters who are quite young about what's going to happen and getting everything ready for them. And we're in an age where, thankfully, we're living longer. Um, how are you having the conversation with your husband now to plan for making sure that you are financially secure enough that when you're older, it's not a burden to your children, that there's enough money left, that it hasn't all been hopefully burned, that because I'm sure you've heard sad stories and situations um, of kids who can't give the care they want to their parents because the money simply isn't there, and so you're making concessions at that time. What's some advice to people listening and steps they can take right now to plan for that later?
Fortunately, my husband and I have had open conversations about money practically from day one. It has never been a difficult topic for us to discuss. And believe it or not, we've actually never had a fight about money. We've argued about other things, but we are really on the same page about our finances. We've both been saving for retirement, for years, and so we have retirement savings. We've looked at those account balances. We have discussed the need for long-term care. We actually went through the process of getting a quote for long-term care insurance a few years ago. My husband is an economics professor, so of course he gets out the spreadsheet and he's like, "But look, if we do this and we invest instead and blah 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 blah." And so and it's always a spreadsheet with him. We got to do the spreadsheet and look at it. And we realize that we will have enough in retirement savings to self-fund long-term care if we need it. We told our kids that. They know exactly how much we have in our retirement accounts, how much money will be there. They know what type of retirement accounts that we have. In my list, got the usernames and the passwords for those accounts for the kids. And so we've been having those conversations, with our kids. Of course, long-term care is very expensive. I don't and if and a lot of people would think, well, you know, my kids, hopefully they're going to step up and help me. But not everyone is in the position where they can do that. I mean, your kids might not be able to quit their jobs to care for you full time. And if you end up with Alzheimer's or any type of dementia, that requires full time, round the clock care, not just like, you know, 9 to 5. It becomes 24 hours. And so that takes a team of caregivers. One person alone cannot provide that sort of care. And people need to realize that, and people need to know that it is incredibly expensive to pay for long-term care. You might have to cobble together, you know, kid who can help a couple hours, paid caregivers who can help. But the sooner you start having the conversations and looking into your options, the more options you have. You cannot get long-term care insurance once you already have a long-term care need. So the best time to be looking into that is to be in your early 50s while you're still relatively healthy. Long-term care insurance is not cheap, but it's a lot cheaper than paying for long-term care out of pocket. So that's an option for sure. Again, as I mentioned, you might want to increase your retirement savings so that you have enough in your retirement savings account to cover long-term care if you need it, just to give people an idea of how much it costs. My mother was in a memory care facility for 8 years. 8 years. I mean, she was 65 when she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. She was relatively young. She was relatively healthy. Um, More than $500,000 that we had to spend on her care. And honestly, that's cheap because I am in Kentucky. Cost of living here is cheaper. If you are on the East Coast, if you are on the West Coast, it's going to cost a lot more. It can cost twice that much. And so this is something that you need to keep in mind that you could be, long-term care could cost $1 million depending on how long you need it. On average, people who need long-term care, the average length of care is 3 years. If you're a woman, lucky us. Again, we're more likely to need care for longer. We're more likely to need care because we live longer. And so if you're a woman, you definitely need a plan. Um, and so these are, this is why it's so important to be thinking about this when you're young and healthy. Because, like I said, you're going to have more options the sooner you start planning.
And so most of our listeners are women. And as you said earlier, for whatever reason, women are disproportionately probably the caregiver to the parents and the family. And so if we have a woman listening today and they're doing all the things, taking care of their parents and all of that, what is one thing that they could do for themselves today to start this process to take care of themselves for the future? Is it getting the long-term care insurance? Is that what you would recommend?
What I would recommend is meeting with a financial planner, like a fee only financial planner, someone who's going to be a fiduciary, who's going to be working in your best interest, not someone who is, a salesperson for a particular, insurance company or someone who's trying to sell you a product. And there are financial planners out there who will charge by the hour or who might, excuse me, who will sometimes like just charge for creating a plan for you so they can look at your situation and say, okay, this is how much money you have. This is how much you might need. Here are your options. These are the experts, and it can be worth spending the money to get that sort of help.
Yeah, that is, I mean, 100% true, on that. Continue on, Cameron, though.
No, I mean, that's it. Like, get help. Go get some help.
And that
Yeah,
same
go
sorry,
ahead.
the same woman, that's something she can do for herself today. If she is getting ready, she's been putting off having that difficult conversation with her parents or a parent. Um, what's one piece of advice that you could give her to have the courage to have that conversation?
My best piece of advice would be that as difficult as these conversations might seem, truly, truly, the consequences of not having them are much worse. You do not want to have to be having this conversation when an emergency happens. It's not the time to have this conversation. You don't have a plan. You're not thinking rationally. Your parents not thinking rationally. Your siblings aren't thinking rationally. You're more likely to end up fighting. You're not thinking clearly. And so, yes, it's a harder conversation, but not having the conversation is harder because that's what I experienced. I didn't have the conversation soon enough. That's why I wrote a book about it. I don't want other people to end up in that situation that I ended up in. I am making sure that my kids don't end up in that situation by having the conversation with them now. It's hard, but like I said, not having the conversation is harder because those emergencies are going to happen. They will happen and you need to be prepared.
You you talk at the end of the book a little bit. It's just like a one page, but I thought it was um so profound that in addition to all of the financial information, the healthcare directives, all of the account information, insurance, there's one more human element to this, and that is getting your parents' stories. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So there were so many things that I wish I would have asked my mom and my dad. My dad actually died at 61. I was 28. And when I was little, he would tell my sister and me bedtime stories about his childhood, which I loved and I cherish those. But then as you get older, you have these questions. You become a parent. You want to know things like, gosh, I wish I'd asked my parents this. I wish I'd asked them that. And because my mother was diagnosed at such a young age with Alzheimer's, I didn't have an opportunity to ask those questions, to get those stories. I mean, now I'll be talking to my kids about things and I'm like, I don't know. I never got a chance to ask my mom to figure that out. I just don't know. And so I think it's so important to use any opportunity. Having dinner with your parents. Hey, tell me the story again about how you met, or you know, tell me what it was like for you growing up, or tell me some more about your parents or your family and where they came from. Hey, you got the family tree mapped out? Show it to me. I'd like to see it. I can't ask my mom those questions now. And so I think it's important to have those stories. And the thing is, too, sometimes those stories can actually be a jumping off point for having these more difficult financial conversations. And so talk to them, ask them about their stories, record them if you can, write them down so that you can share them with your kids.
Cameron, this has been such an incredible conversation. I've learned so much, and I know that people listening to this, we like to share resources. You've provided so many resources in this conversation. And so the last question is, if you were to go back in time, you know, to a time before your mom had dementia and you started handling all these situations, what's advice you would give yourself?
My advice would be to get more help, to not think that I can do it on my own. Like I mentioned, I've worked with an estate planning attorney, but probably would have been a good idea for me to meet with that financial advisor, to work more closely with an accountant, with my mom's finances and tax situation. I thought, well, I can handle this. Personal finance journalist, I've got this covered. And so there's just getting professional help, and then getting help from friends and from other people who are in the same situation. That's so important. That can feel so validating because when you're a caregiver, you feel so alone and isolated, and you're thinking, gosh, I'm the only one going through this, but you're not. There's so many people out there. So if you can tap into those support groups, I mean, there are lots of support groups on Facebook. Maybe you don't want to be there every day listening to everyone talk about their caregiving woes, but it's good to have a group that you can turn to, that you can bounce questions off of. Are you having this issue? How have you dealt with it? Um, ask for help, get support, because this is not something that you should do alone.
Uh, Great advice, Cameron. CameronHuddleston.com is your website. There's great resources on that. The book is Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk: How to Have Essential Conversations with Your Parents About Their Finances. I would encourage everybody to order that book and read it. It's just chock full of great stories and great advice. And we are so appreciative of you coming onto the Spark Me podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Cameron. It was so awesome. So wonderful to have you.
The information presented in this podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only. It does not constitute investment advice, financial advice, trading advice, or any other type of professional advice. You should not make any investment decisions without first consulting with your own financial advisor and conducting your own research and due diligence.